Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Iran wants to have the best of both worlds, engaging its arch enemies, Israel and the United States, in various forms of warfare, while not paying any price of doing so directly. The take is, of course, finding proxies willing to put their people's lives on the line for Tehran. Each of them has its own agenda, but together they add up to a regional strategy. With that in mind, could Hezbollah, the Houthi-dominated Ansar Allah, Iraqi militias, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and others take part in a wider escalation? To help us unpack it, let's turn to the United Kingdom, where we're joined by retired Colonel Joel Rayburn, who is a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, as well as the U.S.'s Special Envoy for Syria, Senior Director of the National Security Council, and, of course, the founding director of the American Center for Levant Studies. Thank you for joining us, Colonel.
My pleasure.
Also joining us from elsewhere here in Israel is retired Colonel Dr. Oren Lerman, who is co-host of TV7's own Middle East Review, Paris and Play panelist, the former Deputy Director of the National Security Council, Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, and last but not least, Editor-in-Chief of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune.
And good on the byline. Sorry.
Indeed. Well, also joining us, of course, is our TV7 Editor-at-Large, and we'll stop with the curriculum vitae there. Mr. Oren.
No CV.
Let's start with this topic today, which is quite serious. What is being done with Iran at a time when its tentacles are going everywhere, leaving a lot of ink, if I may add, and not getting any causality in its backyard, since it is perpetually and obsessively distancing itself from any activities occurring throughout the region?
So, Jonathan, as you well remember, in about 5 weeks' time, we will mark the 4th anniversary of an important event in regional history. And that is the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in early January of 2020. And obviously, absent Soleimani, the Iranian strategy of using proxies to encircle Israel and to try and degrade American assets in the region and to undertake other malign activities was hampered. And when one looks at the October 7 attack by Hamas, which was apparently unbeknownst to the Iranians beforehand, and was, on the other hand, inspired and instigated by them. The question arises, how do the Ayatollahs and the IRGC, and especially the Quds Force, regard what is happening as part of their grand plan, but not in close coordination with them? Do they like it? Do they dislike it? Are they now afraid of the response by either Israel or the United States? Are they trying to exploit the situation which unfolded? And it seems that they are of two minds. They would rather take their own initiative on their own sweet time. They didn't want Hamas to surprise them. They had to contend with it. The next day, on October the 8th, Hezbollah, obviously after consultations between Hassan Nasrallah and his Iranian masters, joined the fight, but only in a limited way, not being dragged into a full-scale war, and obviously also fearful of Israel using a war with Hezbollah as a stepping stone into a war against Iran, an attack on the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. And therefore, we should see the Houthi attacks on Israel as part and parcel of the Iranian scheme, but also we have to find out through intelligence, if we can, whether the Houthis saw an opportunity to show that they are also players in this game, or whether they were pushed into it by Iran.
Indeed. Thank you, Mr. Oren. Colonel Rayburn, I'd like to start with you. When you map out the entire region, what do you recognize as the greatest challenge at hand, and what are the efforts at this stage within that context to try and curtail that reality?
Well, the starting point has to be, and here I differ a little bit from our colleague that I don't think the Houthis are an independent actor. I don't think the Houthis make their own decisions. I don't think Hamas makes its own strategic decisions. I don't think Hezbollah, nor the Iraqi militant groups. I think this is something like what happened on October 7th. And there's been a great deal of ink spilled since then, essentially trying to claim that the Iranian regime was surprised by it, Hezbollah was surprised by it. I find that implausible. I think something as big as October 7th done by Hamas is done in full coordination with the supreme leader, and probably the timing is approved by him, and the whole concept is probably approved by him. So I think rather than see these as independent actors that are trying to make a name for themselves, you have to see it in the vein of a supreme leader and IRGC region-wide campaign. And there are quite a few danger spots still that, were it not for the Gaza crisis, if what's happening, for example, on the northern front would be making headlines, what's happening in Iraq and Syria, where Iranian-backed militants are attacking U.S. troops and U.S. facilities, would be much more prominent. What the Houthis are doing, and probably with IRGC and Hezbollah advisors directing them against international shipping or ballistic missiles or cruise missiles that they're firing in the direction of Israel and others. I mean, those would be, absent what's happening in Gaza, that would be front page news, I think, at least in some parts of the world. So I think we have to watch these danger spots. There's a lot of political instability against which these conflict steps are taking place, and that's worth looking at too. I think, for example, Iraq, and we can talk a little bit more about that in another turn of the conversation, if you like.
Absolutely. I think it's important to highlight, and I do also share your point of view on the matter of Iran pulling the strings. One thing that should be highlighted on a number of occasions before the October 7th onslaught of southern Israel, there was quite a photographed meeting between Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, together with Ziad al-Nahala of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Saleh al-Arouri, who is the head of Hamas in Lebanon, but also in charge of the AOR of the West Bank, so-called, or the districts of Judea, Samaria, and the Jordan Valley. And therefore, there were a lot of indications that this was jointly coordinated to a certain degree, at least, and Iran was behind the preparations. Also, the modus operandi utilized by Hezbollah along the border is very similar to that of Hamas during the riots that were instigated along the Gaza-Israel border leading up to the October 7th events. That is also something that should be highlighted. But we can go on and on and on about the various similarities between the two theaters. But Colonel, or Colonel as well, Dr. Lehrman, may I refer this to you? How do you see this aspect?
Well, if I may, I have a halfway position on this, and I think I'm doing some reverse engineering from intelligence. Hamas, I believe, were wary of being too open about the actual date of action for a simple reason. They assume Iran is penetrated. If the Israeli intelligence is able to get rid of Iran's most prominent nuclear engineer when he goes to lunch, I'm not sure Hamas would have, the group inside Gaza, which made the ultimate decision on date and mode of action, would have felt reassured enough to share this with the Iranians. However, I also agree that this, in nature, in intent in terms of its place in the wider scheme of things. This is certainly something that the Iranians knew about. Increasingly, we find out we also knew about, but sort of relegated to the realm of fantasy, that this could actually be done. The Iranians knew about it in that sense. And the reason the date and the specific timing is important is that if indeed Hezbollah and the Iranians did not actually anticipate this on the day, it means that when if they lost crucial 36 to 48 hours in getting their act together, by the end of that period, two things happened that changed their calculus. One was a full, massive, unprecedented Israeli mobilization. I think by far the largest, probably the largest ever in numbers and the largest ever in proportion to the standing force since 73. And the second is the American intervention. And it is, and the story is now, to a large extent, about as much about the impact of the American intervention as it is about the Israeli role in the war. Because Hezbollah clearly had to take into account when they chose this halfway house solution, this, I won't call it pinpricks, we lost lives in the north. We've evacuated a massive number of people from the border areas in the north. But at the end of the day, knowing what they are capable of, this is way below the level of what they could employ had they not been forced to think twice. But they have been, because the IDF is ready, standing ready for a large-scale operation if necessary. And you don't quite blithely ignore an American warning that comes from the President of the United States telling you don't. And I think that also is reflected in the Iranian position. At the same time, they are trying to wear down American resolve. This is being done in a small scale by the Houthis. And to some extent, we are reading now about Iranian boasts. I have to yet see the evidence of actual action, but the Iranians are boasting that they accosted the Eisenhower task force in the Gulf and forced it to change course. These are boasts, but these are dangerous boasts, because next time it could actually happen, and then the distance between this and an all-out outbreak could be very short. And you have, I think, nearly 70 cases of attacks by IRGC-affiliated elements in both Syria and Iraq, to which the U.S. has already responded, if I count CENTCOM announcements, 4 times already with airstrikes. So we are not at war, but we are not at peace either. And we are sailing into even more volatile waters once Israel resumes its military operations in Gaza, which at this stage is only a matter of time.
Indeed. Of course, miscalculation is something that we've been talking about for quite some time now. Nevertheless, when you refer to the remark made by U.S. President Joe Biden, namely don't, it was also a double-edged sword. I believe it had also implications for Israel, a constraining implication, but also a deterrent one. In other words, constraining Israel from acting so long as Hezbollah maintains its activities under the threshold war or the war threshold. And Mr. Oren, when we're looking at that picture, nonetheless, we see more and more proxies releasing a lot of propaganda about their intentions to so-called attack U.S. forces. The United States seems in a policy of containment, which is basically having an elephant in a China house or stores, because the Middle East does not understand containment. It only understands friction, and the more they see, the more obviously this friction causes them to be deterred.
Yes, but the Iranians having a conspiratorial bent of mind, mu'amara. They are always in the belief that others act like them, especially those wily Israelis, conniving. The Israelis look as if they are innocent victims, but actually behind the scenes they are preparing an attack and looking for a pretext. And therefore we Iranians should not give them this excuse. And much like in 2006, when Hezbollah did not anticipate that the Israeli reaction to the abduction of 2 soldiers would be to go into Lebanon in a major campaign, the Iranians do not want to lose their prime proxy, Hezbollah, as a result of someone else, a relatively minor proxy like Hamas, coming out with something not directed out of central casting in Tehran. And therefore, we shouldn't always try to see it as a deterrence versus containment equation. They may believe that the United States is holding its powder dry because it has something else in mind. Now Biden is going into an election year. Donald Trump is always acting against him, saying that he is weak. That will, of course, push Biden to try and look strong. So let us, Iran, for the time being, sit idly by and not do too much.
Well, with emphasis on try. Colonel Rayburn, I'd like to ask you to maybe touch on the maritime domain, considering the fact that this is becoming an increasingly active domain. You mentioned already some of the threats emanating out of this, but of course, beyond what also Dr. Lerman has mentioned, and that if that isn't true, indeed true, namely the Eisenhower being forced to change course by IRGC naval vessels, the dire consequences thereof could indeed have far-reaching consequences that the Iranian regime itself won't be able to sustain. What can you tell us on the broad aspect of things?
Well, it is true that the IRGC claims that they forced the Eisenhower to alter its course going through the Strait of Hormuz, but I mean, it's probably not true that Eisenhower actually did that, and I don't think it's true that the IRGC Navy would want to tangle with the Eisenhower carrier group. The Iranians would wind up at the bottom of the Persian Gulf very quickly if that were to happen. However, it's part of an overall hostile posture that the Iranians are adopting in the maritime domain, not just there, but off the Bab el-Mandeb, now in the Indian Ocean, which is a danger to international shipping, as I've said before in this discussion, Jonathan. So elsewhere, though, I still think that it may be that Hezbollah is deterred from entering into the fray to the scale that they might otherwise have done. Probably, I agree with our colleague, surprised by the way in which the IDF was able to split its attention between Gaza and the north. I think in a way that the Iranians and Nasrallah and so on didn't anticipate. And I also think they probably didn't anticipate that the IDF ground operations would proceed as quickly and as effectively as they have, isolating all of northern Gaza in fairly short order. But if you look beyond that, the places that I think are the risky theaters are Iraq and Syria, and there the card that the IRGC and the Supreme Leader seem intent on playing is to use the Iraqi militant groups against the U.S. presence. The maritime domain, as we already mentioned, but also then in the Iraqi political arena, and this is something that we haven't talked about before, but the stakes are pretty high for Iraqi provincial and regional elections, which are coming up next month, potentially maybe a little into February, depending on the timing of and how the election arrangements get done. But there's the Iranians. There's a political contest going on between the Iranians and their allies on the Iraqi political scene, and those that are aligned with the U.S. This is taking place against the backdrop of this armed conflict that's going on. But there's an awful lot. You can see the Iranians and their allies, I think, trying to position themselves using the conflict against the United States for some kind of advantage in this political struggle over control of Iraq's local governments, which would indicate then the next time who would have the advantage in national elections after that. So there's an awful lot. There's an awful lot politically going on in the Iraqi theater at the same time that all this is playing out in the rest of the region.
2 points that I think that are very important to highlight. The first one regarding Hezbollah. The fact of the matter is Hezbollah has gone out of its way to impose censorship by avoiding extreme imaging, which we see coming out of Qatar through its Al Jazeera mouthpiece, to avoid directing it through Al Mayadeen and other Hezbollah-dominated networks to its own population in Lebanon, as to not ratchet up pressure on Hezbollah to attack Israel, something that should be taken note of. And the second point that I think is very important to highlight is that the PMF, as you mentioned, and that is a very crucial point, obviously the United States, nor Israel, nor anyone in this region wants once again to see Iraq destabilized to the point that the Islamic State and other bad actors would reemerge in a very decisive force throughout this region from that country. But at the same time, the PMF, the Popular Mobilization Forces, or Hashd Shabi, 67 separate militant groups, out of which some 46 are affiliated to the Islamic Republic of Iran, are both supported and funded and armed by Iran, but at the same time, they also have government funding from the Baghdad central government, which is quite a tricky position for the United States to play within that very stringent position. How do you see Washington actually force the Baghdad to alter its course in this sense?
Well, the U.S. is not postured to do that right now. And it's because the approach is, as I've mentioned before, from the U.S. administration is to focus on de-escalation as opposed to actual deterrence. What's happening? I mean, under the guise of this regional conflict and being and trying to contribute, so to supposedly, to the crisis in Gaza, the parts of the Hashid that the Iranian regime controls are in they're in the process of attempting to consolidate political power in Baghdad, as well as to exert dominant influence over the arrangement of the Kurdistan region as well. And they've got these elections coming up. I'm telling you, they're going to pull every lever they have to try both to win the elections, but also to cheat in the elections, to try to capture an even greater share of political power at the local level in Iraq. And even now, the kind of power that Qais al-Ghazali, the head of Asab al-Haq, and Abu Fadak, the head of Kataib Hezbollah, and even Nuri Maliki back behind the scenes, Hadi al-Amri, the kind of power that these guys are exerting over the Iraqi government in Baghdad to the disadvantage of the United States and all of our allies in the region is stunning. It's the kind of power that I don't think even Qasem Soleimani was able to wield in Baghdad when he was alive. So it's a really dangerous consolidation of PMF power that's in process in Baghdad right now. And even more, I mean, that'll wind up being a threat to Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Israel and everyone else that's allied with the United States in the region. So this is taking place. You know, it's kind of flying under the radar, but it's something. It's as though the IRGC and the Supreme Leader are trying to steal a march in Iraq while the world's attention is on Gaza.
Which includes also, of course, mass deployment of PMF along the Jordanian border, which also threatens the eastern border of Israel. Dr. Lerman, you have 2.5 minutes.
In a more general sense, I was reading very carefully National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's essay at Foreign Policy, which is sort of aspiring to be the new George F. Kennan essay, The Sources of American Power. And I've read President Biden's Washington Post editorial. Both of them still regard the Iranian angle of the situation as a side thought, as a passing reference, as a side thought. No, it isn't. There must be a change of paradigm, looking at Iran as the third element in this confluence of forces that includes the Russians and the Chinese. And there needs to be a focus on Iran's role in the region rather than sustaining the vain hope, which has more or less evaporated, of cutting a deal with it.
Last sentence.
And that would bring all of these issues that we've been discussing under one paradigmatic roof for the US government. I think the military is already there, the political echelon is not.
Mr. Oren?
Iran, China is, of course, number one in the American scheme of things, Russia number two, and then you have Iran and North Korea. But for the time being, North Korea is not part of our regional scheme. Now, one comment which will end with a question mark rather than an exclamation mark. How come neither of the natural gas rigs in the Mediterranean was even a target of either Hezbollah or Hamas during the conflict? And my guess is that Iran knows how vulnerable it is with its long coastline, with its shipping, with Bandar Abbas and all the rest. And
Hard Island.
yes, and it asked its proxies to refrain from doing it.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today, and there are a lot more topics to discuss in relation to this, so we will revisit it in the near future. I'd like to thank Colonel Rayburn, Dr. Lerman, and Mr. Oren for taking part in today's panel. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next panel from here in Jerusalem. Shalom. For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at tv7israelnews.com.